Thank you for joining us. We're really excited to have this panel. I think it'll be quite engaging and illuminating. This is an amazing investigation. I'm looking forward to hearing about how it came to pass. Our moderator for this evening is my esteemed and adored colleague, the Pulitzer Prize winner, Debbie Sensiper, who joined our faculty about 3 years ago. We lured her away from George Washington University and the Washington Post, where she had been an investigative reporter since 2007. Prior to that, she was at the Miami Herald, and I believe she started her career at the Charlotte Observer. It was at the Herald where she won that Pulitzer. We were so thrilled to be able to get her because we had great anticipation about her leadership of our newly rechristened Medill Investigative Lab, and she has more than lived up to those expectations, taking our students through some brilliant investigations. I don't know if you saw her coverage of the effects that COVID had on nursing homes around the country, but it was stupendous. The students did a wonderful job under her leadership, and again, we are so proud and pleased to have her in the Medill family. With that, let me turn the proceedings over to Debbie. Debbie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah. It's so great to be back in Chicago, and it's so nice to see all of my colleagues and some of my students who I've never met in person before, and I'm, at least, it's just been Zoom for so long. I'm so happy to be here, and I am absolutely thrilled to introduce this panel and this investigation and have this engaging discussion just tonight about whistleblowers in the press. If you don't already know, let me introduce our panelists to you. First, we'll introduce Jason Leopold, and he is a senior investigative reporter at Buzzfeed News. He's a 2018 Pulitzer finalist for international reporting, and he was a lead author on the project we're going to be discussing tonight, the FinCen Files, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize just last year in international reporting. Jason, if you don't know, is one of the most foremost FOIA experts in the country. He's widely known and widely feared by the government and others. He was once identified as by far the most active FOIA litigator in the United States today. His FOIA work has focused on, helped lead to the release of Hillary Clinton's emails. Oh, yes. I almost was a little nervous about saying that to a group in higher education, but we went with it. Yes. But he has reported on the California energy crisis, safety issues at BP, human rights abuses at Guantanamo, and he began his career writing obituaries, which I thought was an interesting, fun fact. And next to Jason, is Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and editor Mike Sallah, who is a senior investigations and projects editor at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And he has written about everything from white-collar fraud to police abuses to war crimes in Vietnam. At the Toledo Blade, he was awarded the 2004 Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting for a series of stories on atrocities committed by Tiger Force, which was a U.S. Army platoon in Vietnam. And his stories also led to an award-winning book, also called Tiger Force. He has been a Pulitzer Prize finalist several times for work on topics ranging from money laundering to deadly conditions inside Florida's assisted living facilities. He is also a Pulitzer Prize-winning editor, and I know that well because he was the editor on a series of stories that I authored at the Miami Herald on corrupt affordable housing developers. So Mike and I go way back. And a fun fact about Mike, after particularly grueling editing sessions and writing sessions, he will come right out and he will say with great pride, there was blood on the floor, Deb. There was blood on the floor. And that is a high compliment from Mike Sallah because every word counts, as the writers in this room understand and know well. He's also the author, as I said, of 2 books. And finally, we are very fortunate to have David McCraw here from the New York Times. He spent the last 19 years at the New York Times. He is the newsroom's top lawyer, and the legal advisor on nearly all of the New York Times' most important stories. Stories about the Me Too movement, stories about Donald Trump's taxes. He is the lead litigation attorney for freedom of information lawsuits brought by the Times, and I was astounded to read that over the past decade, the Times has brought more than 90 FOIA cases against the federal government, and that those cases led to the release of secret records about everything from chemical weapons in Iraq to drone killings abroad. He is a graduate of the University of Illinois, Cornell University, and Albany Law School, and he is lecturing right now at Harvard Law School. He also recently authored a book that I thought you'd be interested in knowing about, Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts, which was an inside account of the legal battles that shaped the Times coverage of Donald Trump's presidency. And that book included topics about national security, Harvey Weinstein, and the rise of political partisanship in America. We are so grateful to have you all here to talk about this important subject, whistleblowers in the press. So, Jason, I thought I would start with you. You spend much of your professional time chasing records, documents, and data, and nurturing sources to get those records. And suddenly you're contacted by a whistleblower from inside the government about this unprecedented trove of documents, of secret financial documents that had never been made public before, that you couldn't really access through legal proceedings or through FOIA. And I'm wondering if you can tell us exactly what she had, why that mattered, and how scared you were or excited you were about running with this.
Sure. You want me to use a mic, right? You know, it didn't happen exactly that way. let me just start off that way. In 2017, I started as an investigative reporter at Buzzfeed News. And this was an unprecedented time because Donald Trump was just inaugurated as president. And so there was a lot of emphasis on covering not just Trump's, the administration, but to, kind of cover everything that revolved around issues related to Russian interference in the election and his past business dealings and his inner circle. My job was I was tasked with following the money. And I had just been working for a number of years at Vice News covering national security. So that was my, primary focus. And I really didn't know, I love the idea of following the money. I mean, it reminded me of All the President's Men, follow the money. I'm like, okay, where do I go? So, you have to cultivate sources, right? As journalists, that's our, that's part of our jobs, is to cultivate sources. And I don't feel like I'm giving away any sort of, sources or methods here, as the government likes to tell me often when they withhold records. But I had reached out to people who may be able to, who may be in a position to explain, what is happening behind the scenes. And in the course of my pursuit of sources and trying to cultivate sources, I had met Natalie Edwards. And at the time, she was in a senior position at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, otherwise known as FinCen, which is an intelligence arm of the Treasury Department. And basically, they're tasked with, prosecuting and ensuring that, and I don't mean that, literally, they don't have that kind of power, but they are there to ensure that, the anti-money laundering laws are banks are following the regulations, and that anti-money laundering laws are being held up. So it turns out that she was a whistleblower. She's somebody that went through what perhaps maybe we often hear is internal channels, right? She went to the Inspector General, she went to members of Congress, And she told me that nobody would listen to her. And I have dealt with whistleblowers in the past, and I was very interested in what she had to say because a lot of it did revolve around what Congress at the time was also investigating. There were a number of committees and subcommittees investigating this administration, and what she told me is that, for example, that Paul Manafort, that the Treasury Department knew about his illicit financial dealings for many, many years and were alerted by banks, but just didn't do anything. So, long story short, because I know we only have an hour and I can go on, is that this was a person who really did try to blow the whistle in terms of laying bare what was taking place behind the scenes and how her office, her agency, was not doing anything. And it wasn't just with Paul Manafort or many of the oligarchs that we're hearing about today. It was, politicians and terrorist groups that FinCen would get these known as suspicious activity reports from banks, and they would just fall into an abyss or into a database, and nobody would ever read them. So as she's telling me this, I asked her if she could back up what she's saying, because that's what we do. And I say that with that kind of emphasis because, when this story came out and when it was revealed that she was the source, there was some shock by my colleagues. Like, you asked her if she had evidence? I'm like, yes. You don't get a knock at the door, where somebody says, unless maybe it is Edward Snowden who was looking for a particular journalist, but that doesn't happen, right? People, will you have to seek them out, and then you ask them these questions, as to whether or not they can back up what they're saying. And that's what I did. And I asked her if she can prove it. I said, I can't go out and report anything now without having that kind of evidence. And so she did then start providing me with this kind of material. And I do happen to be a document person. And the reason is largely, and it goes way, way back, is I do believe that the public's trust in the media, even back then, was waning. And a way to get the public to believe and support what you're reporting is to provide them with that kind of documentary evidence. And look, I work for Buzzfeed News. I did not work for the New York Times or the Washington Post. So if I am presenting, this kind of reporting to readers, at the time they were still like, it's BuzzFeed. Why are we going to believe that? So I needed to go that extra mile. So that kind of evolved into more reporting and more reporting and more evidence and more evidence, and to the point where it became a series of stories that started out with Paul Manafort and all the people who were in Trump's inner circle and their illicit financial dealings, or I should say alleged illicit financial dealings, and then it evolved into what became the FinCen Files. We realized that these records are they're deemed law enforcement material or law enforcement sensitive. They're not classified. They've never, ever seen the light of day. It was like on a rare occasion, I think, when Elliot Spitzer was being prosecuted, perhaps when one of these SARs had ever come out. So these were real coveted records, and it was that was more or less the start of it.
And so you had documents with $2 trillion of transactions. So as reporters, Mike, where do you begin? How do you start digging into a trove that large and that significant?
You take these records. We have really good data people that can take it and make them searchable, which wasn't an easy task. But with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and Buzzfeed, the best of the tech people in both news organizations
So just so that everyone is clear, part of this trove was 2,100 suspicious activity reports, SARs. And SARs are what banks submit to the Treasury, to FinCen, within the Treasury, to say, we think that there might be someone moving money through our financial institution, and it might be proceeds of crimes or money laundering, illicit wealth, things like that.
Yeah, banks are required to file them under the bank secrecy, under the BSA, the Bank Secrecy Act. And it really got picked. They started in '92 with maybe 100,000 SARs filed, and now it's up to maybe 1 million every year of suspicious activity reports. But they're required, and they get in trouble when they don't. You'll find that when a comptroller of the currency or the Treasury will go in, or another wing of the Treasury will go in, and they'll do these audits. And if they're not doing their job, they will fine them, and many times they'll find criminal violations.
And the concern of Ms. Edwards and others is that SARs were being filed and they were doing nothing. The Treasury Department wasn't
Collecting
really-
dust.
Yeah, collecting dust. Okay. And before we get into the project, David, I just wanted to ask you, at the New York Times, you get leaks all the time, I would imagine, and you hear from whistleblowers all the time. And just a couple weeks ago, I think the Times published a big story on a leak out of a Swiss bank and the people who were hiding their money there. And I just wondered, as a lawyer for the New York Times, do you ever say no? I mean, what do you do to do your due diligence on people who were leaking information to the Times? Are there basic steps that you take as a lawyer to guide your reporters and editors?
Can you ask an easier question to start with? Just get me warm. No, that's a good
We're
question.
jumping right in.
The first thing I have to say is, as the outsider here, this was an incredible piece of reporting, and by all the measures that legislative change in I think 3 countries at least, maybe more, they changed the whistleblower protection at FinCen as a result of this story, so that people would stop coming to the likes of Jason and maybe actually go to the authorities on this. So this deserves all the attention that it should have got at the time, and I hope we'll get over time. The answer, though, Debbie, is that in most of these cases, the First Amendment is so strong that the legal lift is pretty light, okay? In that, and I'm putting it with a footnote on there because I think this particular body of law is under attack, but we hear a lot, you've heard a lot about Times versus Sullivan and libel and Pentagon Papers and prior restraint. But probably for our era, the most important Supreme Court decision is a case called Daily Mail, Smith versus Daily Mail, which people don't talk about a lot. But what it said, in plain terms, was that the First Amendment protects journalists, newspapers they said, but journalists, when they publish truthful information lawfully obtained in the public interest, unless there's some extraordinary interest which the Supreme Court has never found. And that question of lawfully obtained is now under attack. So normally in my job, it's really asking the reporters, kind of, how did you come to get this information? And at the Times, we rarely have a big debate over has a line been crossed or not. But that's really been the focus. What's happened, and I'll stop here and we'll get back to it, but with the prosecution of Julian Assange and some other cases that have raised questions about this, what is lawfully obtained is I now think is really under attack, and it's going to be very important because historically, while the whistleblower faces liability, the journalist has not. That's how the First Amendment works. What you're seeing, though, is now this, and lawfully obtained has always meant, even if the person who gives you the documents has committed a crime, as long as you, the journalist, didn't participate in it, you're going to be covered by the First Amendment. I think that now is under attack as to what is routine news gathering and what's unlawful.
Yeah, we should definitely come back to that in a moment, because I have a few more questions about that. But I wanted to ask quickly a little bit about the main findings in the FinCen Files. But before we do that, for Natalie Edwards, I mean, what drove her? Was it, I mean, she truly believed, it sounds like, that there was a significant national security risk here.
Yeah, that was one of the first things she said to me when we met. And I could see and I could tell that she truly believed it and she was passionate about it. And I really think it's going to be hard to articulate this, but whistleblowers, people who are whistleblowers, are, interesting is not the right way to describe it. They are putting everything, they're putting their lives at risk, their livelihood, because they truly believe that that there's an injustice and that they are compelled to speak out. And I think that is certainly the case for Thomas Drake, Reality Winner, for Natalie Edwards. She believed that that she was violating the oath that she took by just standing by silently. And her complaints, her concerns were wide-ranging. They were not just they did not just revolve around the fact that the FinCen would receive these suspicious activity reports and nothing would be done, and therefore national security was at risk. There were issues that, and I actually wrote about this before writing about anything related to suspicious financing, that they were operating, an arm of Treasury was operating without having an Attorney General's guidelines on Executive Order 12333 regarding domestic surveillance. And she was actually right. And I reported that, and the Inspector General ended up investigating it. And while the Inspector General did not, conclude that her main complaints had any merit, they did find that, they had been operating for quite a while without having approved Attorney General guidelines, and so they, had to go and get that. So this was, she really believed that she had to speak up. And then as I I've known her now for 5 years, that could see that in every part of her life. So it really is, just in her DNA. And I've come to learn that that kind of, trait is in whistleblowers. I mean, they're the ones who will step forward.
And risk everything to do
Yeah.
it. Mike, can you take us through briefly? I mean, you were ahead of your times. We're now talking about Russian oligarchs, and as we talk about what's happening in Ukraine, but really, FinCen Files was ahead of its time in looking at that. Can you walk us through some of the highlights of the findings of this project?
Sure, we both
Yes.
can weigh in, sure.
Mike.
So, well, one thing, it's great to start out with just basic thing. Banks are the first line of defense in the war against money laundering. They're basically deputized as entities because they're the ones that are taking in the money. The government doesn't see it, the banks do. So they're charged with a very important responsibility. And a lot of that was really raised, number one, when you had the drug cartels in South Florida. In 1970, the Federal Reserve found that the banks in South Florida had a $5.5 billion surplus over and above any of the other districts. They figured it's all drug money. It was all drug money coming in. So they started putting the banks on notice, and that's where it begins. There you go, Natalie Edwards. Okay, so once these SARs opened up, and you can see a copy of one right there, this is interesting because you talked about oligarchs. And Arkady Rottenberg is Putin's judo instructor. And he owns many, many shell companies. He is an oligarch in his own right. He's Putin's one of his oldest friends. And he has had billions of dollars in contracts with the government as part of a very corrupt system. And so he came up in the course of these SARs. We found the North Valley cartel money being moved for one of the most violent groups in South America moving drugs. And we found, in the case of Rottenberg, the bank is called, I'm going to call it Soc Gen. I'll butcher the French, but it's Societe Generale, it's the bank. They were, as a correspondent bank in New York, they were asked to move $36 million for a company called Breckenridge. So Soc Gen in New York says, well, we got to figure out who this is, big round numbers, and we got to find out who it is. So they call their parent bank in this is the one in Switzerland, and says, who is this? And Soc Gen says, we're not telling you. He says, well, you're our bank. Yeah, but we're still not telling you. So what now, in a case like that, you either drop the customer or you refuse the transfer. But what did Soc Gen in New York do? They moved the money. 2 years later, during the Panama Papers, the big, with ICIJ broke this big story on these offshore banks. It was a leak out of Mossack Fonseca. It was a law firm in Panama. They find out that Breckenridge was owned by Arkady Rottenberg. And so they decided, we better do a CYA here. We're going to cover ourselves. Let's file a suspicious activity report and say 2 years ago we moved $36 million for him. See, you see, these are the little things that we were catching in the course of our investigation.
Yeah.
You know. Paul Manafort? You want to talk about Manafort?
Yeah, I mean, as part of, what was fascinating about Manafort was obviously he came under scrutiny right after Trump, or during the campaign, and certainly after Trump was inaugurated. And what we found was that, once he was prosecuted by Mueller, we found these SARs that I shouldn't say we found within the SARs that FinCen had been alerted to these suspicious financial transactions, wire transfers that appeared to be, Manafort and Rick Gates laundering money, and that they had known about this for years and years and years.
Since 2004.
Since it started in 2004 and
Continued.
and just continued, yeah. And it was, I'm going to tell a very quick story. So. As I was investigating Manafort, I was looking for, again, sources. I happened to reach out to an FBI agent. And I said, listen, I'd like to talk to you about, I know this may seem unusual, but here I am. I'm a journalist, think of it as like the scorpion and frog. I got to call you. I said, is there any chance that we can meet? And this is what I wanted, to talk about. And he said, Jason, I just retired 2 days ago. I would be happy to meet with you. I told my editor, my editor said, get on a plane now. I went out and met this person, and it turns out that this person happened to have been the one investigating Manafort in 2014. And that's where I started to learn about how much the government knew, and at the time, how it made a choice, right? That you had Viktor Yanukovych, who was looting Ukraine, and then they had, which was to the tune of $1 billion, and then they had this guy Manafort, who appeared to be laundering maybe $50 million, and a decision had to be made. Do we go after the billion, or do we go after the little guy, what they considered the little guy? And they went after, try to recover Yanukovych's money and let Manafort walk. And what was unbelievable to me was, hearing from a number of people who said, if Manafort never got involved with Trump's campaign, they never would have looked at him, So there was a lot of politics clearly at play here, and so.
But again, it's the whole idea that you can just keep moving. You're filing a suspicious activity report, and then you just continue to move the money again and again, and that's what gets it. Another gentleman, I use that term loosely, Simonia Magolovis, who's the boss of bosses and considered one of the most ruthless members of Russian organized crime. He's in the SARS, and these Venezuelan contractors who were ripping off the government, as you know what was playing out. They were moving the money into Miami, buying mansions and Lamborghinis and horse farms up in Wellington, polo fields. So these were other ones we were finding. This is one of our more interesting findings. Igor Kolomoisky is a Ukraine oligarch. Deutsche Bank moved money for him for 10 years, filing SARs, moving the money, and it was money he had stolen from his bank in Ukraine, where he was a majority shareholder. He moved it through multiple shell companies into the United States, and he bought steel factories and skyscrapers without a name on any of the property records. But the SARs bared that out, and we were able to kind of track his money laundering in the United States. We talk a lot about Miami and New York being a mecca for bad operators, but he took his money into Cleveland, and he became the largest commercial landlord in Cleveland. He owned all their iconic skyscrapers, as well as 13 steel factories. There's one irony about that. We have an agency here called the Committee for Foreign Investment under Treasury. Well, Treasury's the chair of it. They're supposed to screen foreign operators, particularly controversial ones, from buying into industries that are considered critical to our national defense. So ask yourself, how does an oligarch from Ukraine buy 13 steel facilities in the United States, including an alloy they make, which is one of the most important alloys in steel making? So how did that happen? So these are some of the things that kind of slipped through the cracks.
It's so interesting because we think of the covert movement of wealth around the world as rich people doing what rich people do, and it doesn't affect the rest of us, ordinary people. But really it does. It did in Cleveland, and it really, a system like this really enables dangerous people to breach our financial system.
And that's what happened in the steel factories. They had explosions. He wasn't putting any money. You squeeze these places for the money. You don't invest in the safety. And what happened was they were getting explosions, cheap parts, and we were interviewing steel workers who were disabled the rest of their lives. Most of them lost, hundreds of steel workers lost their jobs. That's the human income. We talk about, most of the time, money laundering is this very opaque or abstract concept, but they're the victims. They're real victims in this, and it happened in Middle America. It happened in the heartland. And so if we're missing something here, we shouldn't miss this because it happened and it affected a lot of lives.
So Natalie Edwards, when this came out, must have felt good. I mean, especially when anti-money laundering legislation was proposed and there were significant results in reaction to this project that must have made her feel like what she did was the right thing.
You mean when FinCen Files came out?
FinCen Files came out.
In 2018, October 2018, I was in Washington, D.C. I was traveling every month from L.A. to D.C. And I got a phone call from Ben Smith, who at the time was editor-in-chief of Buzzfeed News. And he said, "Did you see what just came out of DOJ?" And I said, "No." And they arrested her. The government, she was arrested. FinCen was raided, and she was arrested and charged with conspiracy, unlawful disclosure of suspicious activity reports, because you are not allowed under the law to disseminate this kind of material. So I unfortunately could not speak to her for a long time. So it was, and we hadn't even started this project. So I do know after, obviously, she was sentenced and FinCen Files came out that she was, because I've since obviously spoken with her, she was very pleased. She felt that this, this is exactly what she had been hoping for. But it ruined her life, And while she says that she has no regrets, and that her concern was the safety of America, that how she will say it, of the American people, and to protect the national security of the United States, and she's very passionate in the way she says that, it ruined her life. And it did help push through, changes to anti-money laundering laws that Congress passed in 2019, I think it was, the end of 2019, 2020. 2020, excuse me. And she made an unbelievable impact in entrusting us with these records. But it came at a great cost. And I had always been the reporter who read those stories about whistleblowers. I had never been the reporter who now was part of it, where my source was being prosecuted. And let me, Mike knows this, the government was coming after me too. And they made it pretty clear in the court documents that, that I was kind of a target. I mean, that was not lost on me at all. So it was a very scary time, while we were reporting this. But we felt, right, like we had to continue, the reporting on this so her sacrifice, because it really was a sacrifice that would not, be made in vain.
There were times Jason and I would talk, this is not easy and journalists feel for this, nobody takes any great glee in this. And I said, Jason, the best thing we can do for her right now is to blow this out and do a really, really good job.
Yep. Yeah.
And, at the end of the day, it will show that her work was not done in vain, but it was done for purpose.
Were you surprised, David, that this had happened? And, we always hear that Obama kind of had this, crack down on whistleblowers, and I wonder if it's getting any better under Biden.
Well, I actually checked this fact on the way out today, and with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of Press, which tracks this, and they do not believe there have been any prosecutions of whistleblowers in the Biden years. And of course, the Attorney General has, in a companion piece to that record, said that federal authorities should not be seeking the testimony or evidence from reporters in trying to make the cases against people who are accused leakers. But it's worth pausing for a moment on the history of this, that in the period before the Obama administration, 1978 to 2008, there were 4 prosecutions of media leakers. Okay, put aside leakers who were helping Russians or Iraq or somebody else, but in cases where it involved disclosure of information to news organizations. Then under Obama, depending on how you count, there were 9 or 12. It depends on who you think is a journalist. Is the woman who was writing, in Petraeus's biography was his lover or was a journalist, or both. But 9 to 12, and then there were 8 during the Trump years. So if you just think about 4 before Obama, 9 to 12 during Obama, and then 8 during the Trump years, clearly a ramping up of it. And so where do journalists run into legal problems, and when do they feel threatened? And there's really 2 aspects to this, both important. One is, of course, when they are pursuing the reporter to be a witness. And the law is surprisingly very weak on this, and the federal law. State law is great in most states, but the protection of anonymous sources has really been stripped in many of the federal circuits, and really leaves the journalist who's trying to protect his or her source vulnerable. And that is a serious problem. The second way it comes up is if the government attempts to frame, as it does from time to time, the behavior of the reporter as aiding and abetting, co-conspiring, crossing the line to where, in the government's mind, that person is not acting as a journalist, it's acting as a partner in the crime of disclosing information. And of course, beneath all this, is how little legal protection there is for the government worker, right? That the government worker does not have the opportunity to make a public interest defense. Prosecuting, when someone's prosecuted for disclosing information, there is no opportunity to argue, but, this helped the public, right? And the final point I'd make on that is that, especially when we're talking about national security, as Jason knows from covering national security, classification is everywhere, and unnecessarily so. And Obama, on Fox News, they used to actually have Democratic presidents on Fox News, he said at the end of his term, speaking of the Hillary Clinton emails, he said there's classified and there's classified, right? Now that is now a hot button on my keyboard. I put it in every brief. Okay? National security. They don't tell Jason, oh, this is the classified. That's the classified. You know, but he's right. But Obama was right. You know, that there's stuff that that definitely should be kept secret. But there's so much stuff that the public should know, and it's being kept from them by a classification system that is not governed by law, that is in any practical way. Is not, we have courts that refuse to take a close look at classification, and what you're left with is a system that really depends on leaks and the great kind of risks that May Edwards took.
Let's open it up for some questions if we can. I know we probably have some. Stacy's coming around here.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, but I'm curious to hear about the collaboration that took place and how that came about.
The collaboration with the International Consortium.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're at BuzzFeed, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the New York
Yeah.
Times, so yeah.
So Mike and I used to work together when Mike was at BuzzFeed News, and on this particular project, you know, we had, as we were looking at this data, as we were going through it, it was enormous, unwieldy. It was just so dense, and we felt that it would be, honestly, would have been great to kind of get this out to the world. And we were just very limited in our capabilities, what we could do inside. So we shared it with ICIJ, and that turned into I think 108 other newsrooms. And I, by the way, as a document person, and as also somebody who is fiercely competitive, the idea of sharing documents that I got with another newsroom was just like it was unheard of. But I was just blown away by how skilled these folks were, and what a collaboration really meant. Where I mean, there was a reporter in Nigeria who found something in the documents and was, had a story that he was going to report out of this. It was remarkable to me. I probably will never collaborate with anyone again because it was also just, painstaking and a lot of work. But it was, I mean, that's more or less, how it happened.
I think having ICIJ was a plus because this goes beyond the U.S. borders. When you're talking about money coming in, these were largely New York correspondent banks. So those are the banks that allow the money to come in. And the money's coming in from all over the world. Everybody wants to get into U.S. dollars. That's why this became such an important project, because dollars are the gold standard for even for the bad guys. And so having those strings in Ukraine and in Russia and in the UK and in Scotland, places you wouldn't expect, but they're really bad. There's a lot of really bad regulatory agencies there that don't really do their job, and so it all comes into the U.S. So having them was a plus, using that. The difficulty sometimes is how to parse it, you know, and at the end of the day, ICIJ had its stories, and BuzzFeed has its, and then we kind of combined them on some fronts. At the end of the day, it worked. You know, it did work. Yeah.
It absolutely worked.
Yeah.
You caught yourself, you started to say FINRA prosecuted, and then you said, well, they don't have that capability, et cetera. What do you think they ought to do when they get slips of paper and they know that there's some kind of money laundering or something ought to be happening? What is it that a government body should do when they see something that might be wrong, but you're not sure?
So one of the interesting bits of a fun fact, if you will, bits of information that came about as we were reporting the story. So we were about 400 journalists that had 2,100 SARs, suspicious activity reports, and we spent nearly 2 years investigating this, reporting it out, contacting compliance officers at banks and the subjects themselves. We realized during the course of our reporting that we had more staff, 400 people, than all of FinCen. They have 250. Or in the division that's you know, supposed to read more than 1 million of these suspicious activity reports that just keep coming in and coming in and coming in and go into a database, what's known as the BSA database, the Bank Secrecy Act database, that is shared with other entities. So what they should have done is, you know, have the ability to kind of look through this, to look for patterns, to look for, you know, this type of, you know, money laundering, or at least allegations of money laundering, perhaps reach back out to the banks to ask for more information. One of the complaints, if you will, that the banks had was that, well, we sent them the report and they never asked us for more information, so we figured, you know, we can just go about doing it. So we realized that the system has just failed, you know, and it wasn't until we reported this that suddenly, you know, legislation was being proposed as part of the Corporate Transparency Act to empower FinCen, to give them more money so they can hire, you know, more people. But I think that was one of the side issues that we noticed, is that here's another government agency collecting intelligence, you know, on people, and it's going into a database and it's just sort of sitting there. So.
Well, you know, one thing we didn't talk about, we should just throw it out there, though, is the accountability of banks. We found, and it's probably one of the most significant things found in the series, was that there were 17 banks that were found to have violated willful and wanton violations. So here, give you a couple examples. HSBC was moving hundreds of millions of dollars for the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, and knew it. Not only knew it, it was deliberate. They were stripping off information on the transfers so that the compliance people in New York didn't see it and that they could move the money. Standard Chartered was doing that for wires that were going to sanctioned entities in Iran. One of them was a company that was making materials for roadside bombs that were killing U.S. soldiers. And they were stripping the information off the transfers. I mean, that's where money really comes in and really drives this whole train, right? So they found banks, 17 or 18 banks, one or the other, violating, could have charged criminals. So once you get the willful, wanton violations, now you're into the criminality. You could have charged HSBC, and there was a hue and cry within the DOJ to file criminal charges. You could also have even identified some of the individuals who were actually doing some of the dirty work. In all that time, not one bank was prosecuted, not one. Criminally, they signed deferred prosecution agreements, and they put monitors in charge. And then we found that they were violating that. From the SARS we had, we found that they were moving money for criminal entities even when they were on this, quote, probation. So that's where some of that accountability really breaks down, at the end of the day. And so you think about it, 1,000 thrift executives went to prison during the savings and loan crisis when the DOJ really went after bad operators in that field. When it came to the banks between 2010 and 2017, 2018, not one banker went to jail. The only person to go to jail was Natalie Edwards.
I'd like to pick up on a suspenseful note that you kind of passed through that has some serious freedom of the press implications, and that is the reference you made to targeting or potential targeting of you, Jason. And there might be a piece of this for David as well, because I'd like to kind of understand what the implications for Daily Mail might be, and whether, David, this was a situation that's part of that erosion you talked about, the protection. Can you share any more of the details with us?
Sure. I mean, I'll just share what I saw in the court documents, and I think David noted it in the way in which the government framed me and my behavior as a journalist, and it worked, right? They took snippets of conversations that took place on encrypted applications, and included that in their, I think it was in the charge sheet, and some of the some of the court papers that essentially portrayed me as like fishing, for her for information. Go search for this, and when you get it, give it to me. And that, again, as I said at the beginning, there was a point where I sometimes feel very defensive of it. When sources reveal to you bad acts that are taking place, the question is can you back it up? Can you provide information? What do you have? So anyway, the point being is that they included this. I read what they were, what the government had. I feel like they portrayed me as a co-conspirator, as a potential co-conspirator, unindicted co-conspirator. I may be going a little too far, but that's how I read it. And certainly during the course of the case, I feel like they did that too. And look, you know what? There were some of my colleagues in the media that tried to portray me that way as well. And I was stunned. Like I said, I don't know how anyone thinks that this kind of information, comes to them, because nobody has ever knocked on my door and said, we would like to present you with a pile of, documents. And, it's always been, trying to find people to do that, but the government tried to kind of frame it that way. I don't know if David had an opportunity to read any of the.
I read the complaint today, in fact, again. But understand the way the law works on this is that the best way legally to get leaked documents is the worst way journalistically, okay? And that is, as Sue Craig found in 2016, she went to her mailbox, the New York Times, and there in a plain envelope were 3 pages from Donald Trump's tax returns. That is the best way legally, because there is no question that the journalist did not engage in any unlawful activity. It is the worst way journalistically, right? Are they authentic? Is somebody setting you up? What do you do? At the other extreme, it's clear what you can't do. You, the journalist, cannot hack into a major company's voicemail system, as we found in the Cincinnati case years ago. You cannot engage in the theft of documents. That's crossing the line. But what Jason's talking about and where the real action here is, okay, in between those two poles, what is journalism as it should be practiced, and what crosses the line where the journalist is becoming co-conspirator, aider and abettor, and so forth. And where you're hearing this now is on things that I think most journalists will tell you are part of journalism today. Giving somebody a burner phone, using an encrypted app. That's not to hide criminal activity, that's to make sure that you don't get detected by people who may want to do ill to you or to the source. And that's why the Assange indictment is so troubling. There's a piece of the Assange indictment that talks about helping Manning try to hack into a classified database. And I think most people would say, I need to know more facts, but that one starts to trouble me. There's one that shouldn't trouble you as journalists and people who care about free press, and that is, part of that indictment is that, that Assange encouraged people to give him documents. Encouraged people to give him documents. Of course he did. And of course Jason did. And of course any journalist who's any good is going to do that. And that they're treating as criminal behavior, and that is really troubling. The government can say, well, Assange isn't a journalist, or whatever they want to say. It's not really the point. You can call him anything you want. That defense is available to every American who receives information, and in fact, that defense was used by the Trump for President campaign in a civil suit in New York 2 years ago when they received documents from the DNC. So it's a very important point, and it is in that gray area. What's journalism that should be protected under the First Amendment, be protected by law, and what crosses the line?
I have one last question, and I'm just wondering, Jason, if you're in touch with Natalie Edwards today. She was recently released from prison after 6 months.
Yeah, she served 6 months in prison, and by the way, it's strange because I was relieved that that was the amount of time that she would serve, but it's also a very long time in prison. You know, like I said, her life was changed, and the reason I was relieved is because we hear these cases, these leak cases that entail 5 years, 10 years, because the information is usually classified. This was not. This isn't classified. It's considered law enforcement sensitive. But still, it's not supposed to be disseminated publicly. I am in touch with her. I speak to her on a daily basis, and she is out now. And I mean, it is, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is extremely difficult, has been for me, you know, to see what happened to her, what happened to her family. I mean, it completely changed me, you know, and it's just been so sad because so much good has come from this reporting. On the day she was sentenced, and I was in the courtroom in New York when she was sentenced, honestly, about an hour after she was sentenced, Biden came out with an executive order that essentially made the pursuit of dirty money, these anti-money laundering laws, the cornerstone of his kind of national security policy. It was just unbelievable, like all the things that were happening that seemed to be linked to the reporting that we were doing, or at least we could highlight that. And it was just, you know, it was awful because, you know, on the one hand, you know, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a human being, you know, and it's, you know, I feel so indebted to her for what she, you know, for what she did. And, you know, the Washington Post did this, did this story on her, referring to her as the forgotten whistleblower. And, you know, and that's what's been very difficult for her, is to sort of, you know, she took this enormous risk, and she really, you know, has seen all the good that has come from it. And it totally changed her. But there's this fear of like also, kind of being forgotten, because you're, the world we live in, so.
Can I just put a footnote on that, if I might here, which is that you should be very concerned about the way these prosecutions are being used to set an example, and they're going after little people when big people leak. Okay, if I put up here the picture of the people who regularly leak to the New York Times, you could name them. You would know them. But are those people being prosecuted? No. People like May Edwards are being prosecuted. And the other piece of this, which I think Jason and Mike have seen, is that the cases are being brought against The Intercept and Buzzfeed. It's very rare. There's one against the New Yorker. Against a leaker to the New Yorker, and one against a leaker to NBC. But by and large, they're trying to set an example going after people who they don't believe can fight back. And that's really troubling.
Yeah, you think her work and her sacrifice will live on through this reporting and through the changes that it created. So thank you very, very much on behalf of all of us. That was